Thank you. I'm the most blessed professor ever. Yes, thank you, DMFT students. Good afternoon. Happy post-lunch. We hope that this topic is going to engage you well enough to keep your blood flowing away from your belly into your hearts and into your brains. Welcome to the intersections of racial and cultural trauma and the hope of healing in our Asian American Christian context. I'm going to introduce myself, and then Dr. Lee will come up in a few moments. But thank you for being here. And we had a number of Asian American people, siblings, friends, colleagues, students come up the last few days and just say, we are so excited. And just having been an alum myself, this is one of the rare times that we get to highlight our Asian American racial and cultural issues in Travis Auditorium. Yeah, so it's a big deal. So a brief overview, we're going to talk about microaggressions and trauma in an Asian American context, cultural and racial microaggressive trauma, a little more detailed, and then general clinical interventions for ministry, for lay people, for those of us who are mental health practitioners. And I just wanted to remind us, these are the stated learning objectives. Couple things. We want to be able to explore our identities as it relates to trauma. How do we make that connection? How do we have multiple lenses, not just a racial lens, but a cultural lens, see a holistic perspective? And then what are those interventions that are useful for addressing this in each of our unique contexts? So I am Jessica ChenFeng. I realize we didn't put our names on here, but they're somewhere on your pamphlets or your phone. My formal role here is Associate Professor in Marriage and Family Therapy in our awesome Doctorate in Marriage and Family Therapy program. Yeah. I wanted to briefly mention, this is a wonderful program. We have our immersive weekend here right now. Our students who come from all over the US have flown in to engage with our symposium. And the unique thing about this program, which I love teaching in, is that these are already licensed therapists who have amazing expertise, who are coming to develop their skills, their consultation abilities in order to serve communities, the church, and bring it together. So that's what this weekend has been about for us, but I think for many of us who are attending. The other role, we are, I guess, formally kind of announcing it right now, is I am the director of the soon-to-launch Asian American Wellbeing Collaboratory, which is, which is a part of our Asian American Center. Dr. Lee will come and briefly talk about that. But what is really exciting about what we're doing is addressing the well-being needs of Asian American Christian families, pastors, and mental health practitioners. So that is our hope, is to really offer research-based support and tools for these communities. All right, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Lee.
You got all the love. I need more love, people. Okay, now I don't feel I don't feel like I've missed out. Thank you. Thank you so much for being all here. Dr. Jessica ChenFeng, I'm just so honored always. We kind of go around and do this dog and pony show in different places, so we get to do it here, and we're really happy about that. So I serve as the academic dean for the Center for Asian American Theology Ministry, which is a long name. And I realize for the translator, I'm talking way too fast, so slow down. Which is the long name for the Asian American Center. I'm also Associate Professor of Theology and Asian American Studies. Now, the Asian American Center has multiple initiatives, and one of the initiatives that we're launching is a Wellbeing Collaboratory. We also have a Filipino American Ministry initiative. We also have a pastoral formation. There's multiple things there. We're actually on this reboot, so that's basically what's happening. I did want to clarify for us what we mean by Asian American. Both of us are East Asian, but in Asian American studies circles or Asian American psychology, there's a term called Jesus. There's a term called, I'm charismatic, so I'm okay with that. There's a term called East Asian supremacy. Why? Because sometimes East Asians are the white people of Asian America. Overrepresented, have all the power representation. It's actually true at Fuller as well. So we are very mindful. When we say Asian American, we mean South Asian American, Southeast Asian American, East Asian American, adoptees, multiracial Asian Americans, everybody's included. So we keep this in mind. And you, because you're all brilliant people, I know that you already know this, but I'm reminding you, right? And of course, a lot of Asian Americans come recently, like because of 1965 Immigration Act. But as all of you know, Asian American history goes back 170 years, right? So it's important for us to recall that. We're not talking about just recent immigrant stuff as well, even though it's important, right? With that in mind, we start, and we want to frame our conversation. So we're talking about racial trauma and cultural trauma, and I think we can frame it this way, where there are two different things, you can kind of get, beat up from two different angles, or if you can think about it slightly different and saying, well, it kind of overlaps, doesn't it, right? That multiple things are happening, just maybe even in yourself. Because if we talk about internalized things, you can have internalized things within yourself from different sides, and it lives inside of you. So you might be attacking different parts of yourself, right? But let's take it more further. Maybe in some sense, it's kind of like this, because if you grow up in an Asian American church or family, you might think that, hey, you know what? And I know a lot of people like this. They're like, oh, my family was so traumatic, so terrible. My church was so terrible. I'm going to run away to the white context. It looks so good over there. And I say, you live in this bubble, and then when you come out, it's like a frying pan, and then you hop out. Oh, there's a fire. It looked pretty good, right? Because the frying pan hurt a lot, but now I'm in the fire. But you don't really realize it until you get there, right? So that's basically how we're thinking about it. I'm going to go quickly in terms of going from microaggressions to trauma. So Chester Pierce is a black Harvard psychologist who basically came up with the term microaggressions. But a lot of the clinical research has been done by Daryl Sue, who recently won an APA Lifetime Achievement Award, right? Like, wow, that's a pretty big deal, right? He's one of the founders of Asian American psychology, which is 50 years old. And he wrote this, he's like the father of modern day clinical microaggression research, right? Microaggression research. In it, he talks about, it's like this everyday micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations, right? Hey, where are you from? I don't know, Virginia? No, where are you really from? My mother's room? No, where are you really from? I don't know, from God? I don't know, what you want from me, right? What are you trying to get at, right? So that's what happens. And he talks about the attributable ambiguity. Like, what just happened to me? Should I be offended? Am I overly sensitive? Maybe I am, but that felt weird. And he says because of this ambiguity in your mind, it causes more harm. He said he was really surprised. Like, wait a minute, but nobody directly attacked you. Like, how can this be more harmful? He goes, because it's in your mind. And it sits there and you keep on thinking about it. Oh, maybe I should have said something. Or maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I should have done this. And it just keeps on going, right? That's why, and he says it happens in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender. It can happen in terms of, race. And I connect this idea so Kevin Nadal is one of Daryl's, he's a professor now, but he's one of the students, right? He comes up with this term called microaggressive trauma. He says he sees people who appear to have PTSD symptoms, but when you go to the therapist, you say, well, what happened? Well, I was at the store and nobody talked to me. And the clinician's like, how old are you? 40, like you just have to like resilience, right? Like this, you should not be traumatized by somebody not talking to you, right? He says because the client recalls the latest microaggression, which is micro, but the cumulative impact is traumatic. So it gets often misdiagnosed. And the clinician says, you need to be stronger. Like, what's wrong with you? Right? When in fact, it's something that's happening to them over time. And it looks like they're traumatized by what? These pin tutors? What's happening, right? So he says what's happening is this is excessive, continuous exposure to subtle discrimination, and it leads to common clinical kind of misdiagnosis. But they are being traumatized. It's just that there's no one traumatic event. In trauma studies, Judith Herman, in her kind of magisterial book, Trauma and Recovery, she talks about what happens to you, when you basically have all this trauma. You basically kind of end up developing kind of a double think, double self. It basically leads to like a fragmentation because you can't really fully own yourself. And one of the things she talks about is really, really interesting that I thought that applied to a lot of Asian Americans is that she basically says, and she doesn't talk about this from racial or even Asian Americans. She basically says when children are abused and they have no place to go and they're stuck, they create a second self. This is in her words, a model citizen. That's perfect. And I was like, holy cow, that's literally Asian Americans. We have to create a perfect model minority self to survive because we can't avoid the microaggressions, which is traumatic. Which everybody's like, well, you're not black. What's happening to you? Like, nobody's shooting you. Why are you complaining? Right? Which is true. Like, we get that. Like, nobody's saying, oh, our experience is the same, but something weird is happening and we can't identify what's happening, right? So it leads to this kind of fragmentation. And of course, one of the things she talks about is this, you basically end up kind of having an intrusion of like different experiences. And this is really is interesting, how you constrict your life. That some Asian Americans won't go to certain places. Or I say you edit your life to certain situations. Like, one of my students said, I realize when I go to my predominantly white Bible study, I only bake brownies. Because one time I brought my fancy Korean pastries. They were like, what's in this? And she said, custard. And they said, no. What's really in this? Pieces of dog? I don't know. What do you want from me, right? What do you think is in there, right? What is this purple thing? Blueberries? Like, when this happens, what do, right? You truncate yourself and say, I'm going to give you the whitest version of myself. Because it is true. I mean, I like brownies. It's not like I don't like it, but I will truncate myself to give you that version only, right? So that's what's happening. So we're talking about microaggressive trauma. Now, what's weird is that we're talking about both racial, which everybody talks about, and cultural microaggressions, which nobody talks about. This is the thing that I think Jessica and at the Asian American Center we're developing, right? Because people don't use microaggressions for what's happening in your own community. Let me tell you what I mean, right? So it's pretty standard racial microaggression kind of topics, themes for Asian Americans. Perpetual foreigner, where you're from, whatever, it just goes on forever. Right? If you're in California, I often meet like third generation, fourth generation Chinese Americans, but I'm thinking, why am I counting generations? Do I count generations for Italian Americans? What generation are you? It's kind of weird, right? Like Todd Bossinger, who's actually, works at, he's third generation, right? Italian American. But do we obsess about his generation as opposed to Ken Fong, who I used to work with, who's third generation Chinese American? Because the idea is affected, well, you're still a foreigner. What kind of a foreigner are you, right? It kind of gets to you. Invalidation of racism, we know it's not anti-black racism. Although, if you are darker skinned Indian American, if you're in the South, there's this one grandpa who was actually from the South, who was from India, he's like straight from India, and he was there to take care of his, grandson. And he was walking around in North Carolina. The cop came over and said, there's a black guy walking around. And they said, stop. He had no idea. He speaks Indian. They slammed him down, and the cops broke his neck. He was walking while black, even though he's Indian. So, because that's how race works, right? It's purely by phenotype, what you look like, But East Asian, we don't get that, obviously. And Southeast Asian, well, it all depends how dark you are, right? Invalidation racism, you don't experience anything. Pathologizing of Asian culture is very common, right? You get we observe so much of it. Like, oh, you watch TV. I mean, not these days, but I'm old. When I was growing up, oh Lord, like every Asian character on TV, just embarrassing. Like, I don't want that. And my parents remind me of that. I don't want my parents. I mean, as a teenager, you don't want your parents anyways. But if they remind you of this thing that TV keeps on saying is embarrassing about you, you don't want them either. We often label that generational or intercultural, but it's racial as well, right? So hyper or asexualizing, right? So hyper for Asian American women, asexualizing for Asian American men. If you want to do research on like dating apps, you know exactly what you mean, right? Well, I'll leave it at that. And invisibility overall, right? Now, this is actually pretty common, actually. This other part is not as common. Cultural. What happens inside of us? I started thinking about this thing because I saw so many people within like Asian American communities. They talked about that some of the deepest hurts they've experienced is not from white people. That's this is what my friend says. He's quite conservative. He says, "Oh no, compared to what the white people have done to me, oh no, my own people, Korean Americans, have hurt me more than anybody else." But no progressive Asian Americans want to talk about that. And I said, "Don't worry, my friend, I will cover that for you," right? Because it's real. Because it's real. I think one of the things that we do at the Asian American Center at Fuller is that we don't have a progressive agenda. We want to say, what's happening? We want to understand tools from everywhere. It's not like some kind of let's try to be more progressive. That's not what the goal is. Try to figure out what's happening and in multiple aspects of it, right? And it turns out that in our Asian American communities, you can actually have gatekeeping. I mean, if you're multiracial, if you're adopted, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not a real Taiwanese American, oh, you drink that boba? Oh, that's not real boba. I'm making fun of Jessica. I was telling her I like this boba place, and she's like, "Oh, Daniel, that's not real boba." I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like tea pumps, oh, that's not real boba. You have to get like Sunbright or whatever. All right. If you know boba, you know what I'm talking about, right? Protective collectivism. It's almost like you're so protective of your community that you end up kind of, people know that individualism is toxic, but what they don't realize is that certain versions or certain expressions of collectivism is absolutely destructive too, right? I think this is where people know, everybody like in America talks about toxic individualism. I'm like, do you know? The other extreme is crazy too. You can't idealize like, oh, Hispanics, they're amazing. Africans, they're amazing. I'm like, okay, they have their own set of problems too. You can't idealize, right? So they have their own weird version of, Asian American collectivism that's really toxic, right? Hierarchical authoritarianism, I think it's multiple ways of explaining it. That sometimes it's Asian American, older generation, because they don't get any respect from the community. They want a lot from the later generation. And that becomes authoritarian. And other aspects of it, they're just terrible people as well, right? Like, I tell people it's so true that Asian American parents love their kids differently, different love language, they don't say I love you, they might feed them or whatever. But I always remind people, they also abuse you differently too, right? It's not like they're all perfect. Culture only explains so much, right? So let's be realistic here. People are broken in different ways. And they also express love in different ways. Essentialistic identity is this. When a minority community starts really affirming their identity, they can be very, very exclusive about what it means to be truly Korean. And it becomes very suffocating. Or truly Thai. Or truly Filipino. And then the community itself start, once again, kind of gatekeeping. And that can be really, really hurtful. And generally kind of a survivor's mentality, which kind of says, well, you know what? We're only surviving anyway because of the oppressive white people, so we can excuse our faults. But that can also be very damaging. So I'm going to share a little imagery in terms of, here you go, here's an Asian American woman, and they're like, you know what? I'm going to go to my Asian American context, that's where it's safe. And then, hey, wait a minute, microaggression, and you realize, oh, wait a minute, it's tons of it. And imagine this, like, 20,000 fold or 50,000 fold, and you know what I'm talking about. So you get like mummified. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm covered in bandages. And you become extremely sensitive and you're like, why so sensitive? I'm like, I don't know, because I'm covered in paper cuts and my skin feels raw. My soul feels raw. So you say, I don't want this. It's toxic. I don't want an Asian American man, totally patriarchal sexist. I'm gonna marry a white man. You think I'm lying? Oh, it's true, right? Now, this is not the only reason multi-racial, interracial marriages happen. I'm not saying that, okay? That would be very offensive. That's not, there is a dimension there, right? But this doesn't explain at all, like as though every single, no, that would be racist too, right? So, all right, so anyways, let's say you run away to a white church, which I've done in the past, run away from my Korean American church to a white church, and you realize, oh my gosh, this is not safe. They're asking me if I know Kung Fu. I'm like, how many times do I have to tell you? I mean, this is a real story. I'm not joking. One person said the first day at this church, most of the people, do you know Kung Fu then? And I'm like, I don't know anything. Why? Do I have to know martial arts? What are we doing here? I'm a pastor, right? I don't know I'm like a security guard, right? So once again, you're like, oh my gosh. And then after a while, you become mummified, right? And then you say, you know what, this is terrible. This is the hardest part over here. Let's go to a people of color space for Asian Americans. And it turns out in certain people of color spaces, Asian Americans are not really welcome. We're like, you people of color? You're white. I'm like, how am I white? Like, do you know what my experience looks like? So, same thing happens there as well. And so, racial and cultural microaggressions. This is the experience of Asian Americans.
I appreciate Daniel so much because there's a way that we need to bring humor into some of these really heavy experiences. And you imagine, right, this image of this Asian American woman. After all of this encounter, what happens? What happens to that person? I just wanted to briefly mention here, and Daniel referenced this, that when we talk about race and culture, all of that is gendered. And so even though that's not going to be the focus of our conversation, to be keeping that in mind, right? Like he mentioned the hyper or the asexualization, Asian women, Asian men, there are unique ways that our racialization, which is how racism shows up in our lived experience, is different for all genders. All right, so I'm gonna now go through this lovely thing that Daniel created. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. All right. I came across a really helpful study published last year. Researchers from University of San Francisco looked at both qualitative and quantitative research of COVID-related anti-Asian incidents, right? So this is sort of like during the pandemic. And I wanted to use that research to highlight what is actually very common emotional, cognitive, and behavioral experiences of Asian Americans in general. But related to this specific research, what they found is, how did these racist incidents affect Asian Americans? One is emotionally, right? We can understand fear. Many of us in the room felt that. Anger, sadness, shock. So things like, I remember early on in the pandemic going out with our son, who was maybe two and a half at the time, and watching people like move, and everyone was afraid of everyone. So who knows if it's racialized, but what I've internalized is that it's always racial, right? I've been avoided before. And so when people move away from us, that's what I'm thinking. This absence of negative emotionality is interesting. And so it's this idea that I'm anticipating something negative, but then the person doesn't do it, right? And then it's not that it's a relief, but it's then the absence of that negative emotion that was anticipated. So a lot of different kinds of emotions that are present with racial encounters. Cognitively, this is where there's a lot of other stuff going on, developing a negative self-worth, a worldview, what's wrong with me, us, Chinese people. I hate being Asian American. This is so, dehumanizing. Hypervigilance, of course, right? Thinking, and to this day, many of us do this. Do I go to this part of town, or when I take my kids to this store or restaurant, what can I anticipate from how people will treat me or look at me, right? This hypervigilance, I think many of us, communities of color, know this well. The moment you make like a split-second eye contact with someone, you can tell if they are okay with you, right? You just like feel it in your body. It's like, oh, okay, I can keep making eye contact with them. It's safe, right? So that hypervigilance is in our bodies, but it's in our thoughts. Asian Americans have diminished our own experiences. For example, a lot of this was happening with a lot of what was going on with the murder of George Floyd, right? Well, we don't have it as bad, right? It's so minimizing that what I'm experiencing could be worse, right? That is a form of coping, but these are some of the cognitions, awareness of systemic racism that began for many Asian American communities. I won't go through all the behaviors, but you can see here what it might shape, right? Starting to ignore certain places like Daniel mentioned, avoiding, self-isolating, hiding Asian appearance, changing the way that someone looks to fit in more. One of the things I've talked to my colleague, Dr. Williams, because our DMFD program goes to different parts of the country, that when I'm traveling in a non-Asian place, I feel safer with non-Asian friends and colleagues. I feel like I'm not as targeted. And so like that helps me hide my Asian appearance, right? I'm less foreign because I have white and Black friends. Seeking social support, that was starting to happen more. Standing up for self, that could also be a behavior. Identity exploration, activism. So there's a whole range, right? It did move people to really identify like, oh, even if my family never talked about racism, this season of our country's history is compelling us to. So that was a brief sort of aside, but you can feel the weight of all of these responses to racial encounters. Now, this is more of a step back. This is not just COVID related. These are sort of things that even before the pandemic, during my private practice years, I was seeing in my clients. So one of the hard things to talk about is it's prevalent in many communities, but anxiety and depression is a common reality within Asian American spaces, right? Many of us can identify those feelings within us. Clinicians observe it, common presenting realities. And how I want to connect it to racial and cultural trauma is an example, right? So if I'm going to a workplace where Asian American identity is not really understood or recognized, and I'm constantly being mistaken for the other Asian American woman at my work, which, by the way, has happened at every workplace I've been at, it creates anxiety, depression. It can fuel that, right? And so I feel like I don't belong. I feel like all of my all my achievements, there's no connection with who I really am. And so while I might have anxiety related to family of origin, maybe pressures from patriarchal values from my family of origin, mixed with my racial context, that fuels the anxiety in a very unique way, right? Same with depressive symptoms. Another common symptom that we see is perfectionism or pursuit of excellence. And we could say that this is sort of intertwined with a myth of the model minority, which many of us implicitly internalize, right? I might mention it later, but there's a book that's going to come out in the MFT field on Asian American issues that my colleagues and I have co-authored. But when I polled my group of high school girlfriends and I asked, what are some of the things your parents told you growing up about race? And many of them said they never talked to us about it, but they did say this very explicitly: keep your head down and just keep doing well, right? That's how you're going to survive and get out of whatever situation we came to the US for. So that mixed with going to work and realizing, oh, people like it when I am not loud and opinionated, right? People like it when I do my job well. And so that reinforces all of the sort of functioning, and that shapes the anxiety. Keep going, keep at it, keep your head down. There's so much more I could say, but I'll leave it at that. Disconnection, avoidance, and addictive behavior. So when you are literally erased out of the psyche of our social and cultural reality, right? Up until recently, you're not visible in media. Up until recently, issues in your community have not been discussed. At work, you are looked over for promotions. You are confused for another person. That can compel people to just stay disconnected, right? Asian Americans have historically had the least political engagement. There's a lot of complex reasons for that. But one is that the US society has not included Asian Americans. And so when you feel disconnected, you would rather avoid being in the limelight, right? And in that, many of us who are clinicians understand then the function of addictive behaviors that develop as a result. Intra-racial and ethnic alliance, or the opposite, which is dissociation, as Daniel mentioned, right? Sometimes overly aligning for good reason, for safety with your own ethnic culture. Right? It's safer to do this. They get me. There's an unspoken thing about this, right? I want to highlight and just, this is like a very small example, but Asian American women friends and students today, I got 2 cups of coffee bought for me, right? Like, this is the hospitality of Asian American cultures that is like embodied in us. And I was thinking, I don't think I would have ever had this experience had I not had friends with this cultural implicit understanding of hospitality. The opposite can be true, right? Because of our own internalized racism, feelings of shame of being Asian, we want to disconnect, right? And this happens sometimes. It's like, oh, I don't want to seem like I'm super Asian, right? I want my other friends to feel welcomed or whatever it might be. So we might kind of go back and forth. Another thing is apathy, settling into invisibility and disengagement, kind of like what I mentioned before. The one thing I will say is very common, especially in like the path of racial identity development, which we don't really have time to get into, is just this constant state of frustration and activation, right? Everywhere I go, I'm just like on hyper vigilant. Is this going to happen? Oh, that person looked at me this way. And then I get home and then like my mom says this to me, like everything feels exhausting, right? Because I've had this cumulative racial microaggressions and the cultural stuff from my family is just mounting, right? And so it's hard because being in that state, you can see all of these things can be really interconnected. And so just highlighting a few ways, and I'm speaking really to the clinicians in the room, when we work with an Asian American client, do we frame our understanding of their symptoms of anxiety and depression as possibly related to these contextual variables, right? It's not just a cultural issue. That's such a loose term, but cultural trauma is always embedded within a racial context. So that was the big blue circle with the red one in the middle. All right, I'm gonna just give you a brief case here. So we have Michelle and David. They are a married professional couple. I worked at Loma Linda University for a number of years as their in-house therapist for the physicians. I was associate director of physician vitality. So I worked primarily with physicians and oftentimes with their spouses. So this is a Asian American couple in their 30s. They're both second generation. Michelle is Vietnamese American, and she is an orthopedic surgeon. For those of you who know, this is one of the hardest services to get into, historically mostly white men, right? So you can already imagine her training context, what she had to be and do to become an orthopedic surgeon. David is second generation Korean American. He is a clinical psychologist, right? And so in a way, they're kind of crossing traditional gender careers or whatever, right? So one of the ways I want to highlight this case is the ways that they've both experienced racial trauma and cultural trauma and how that might show up in their marriage, okay? So the issue of invisibility. So Michelle, in order to make it through med school, residency, fellowship, she was really quite invisible, right? She had to just keep her head down, make sure she wasn't, people might know this term. In medicine, there's something called pimping. And it's when senior faculty actually really try to call out younger trainees to embarrass them, right? Shame them. It's part of this culture. And so she tried really hard not to get called on. So she just could slide through and do what she needed to do. Plus, all the places she moved to get trained, she was usually one of the only Asian Americans. So when she became a senior physician, she'd go in to see a patient with a white medical student, and the patient would look at the white male medical student and actually say during COVID, I don't want her as my surgeon, right? When she was the best. So this is common. This is like day to day, literally, I was doing trauma interventions with every physician that came in, and I worked with them through the pandemic. This is not an exact case, but this is a compilation of many cases. So invisibility, her whole life. Same with David. And so what was interesting about David is that he pursued a path. They both grew up in religious contexts where becoming a psychologist was not the norm. Right? It wasn't what was expected of him or hoped for by his parents. And in a way, when he went through the program, he was trying not to be overly highlighted, right? Because he didn't want to draw attention to himself, be picked on. And among his group of friends growing up who were largely Korean American, he felt sort of shamed that he was not pursuing a traditional path that his parents had wanted for him. Both of them came in with quite a bit of anxiety, hard to relax. One thing that is very common in children of migrants, people who have had to survive, people who have inherited generational trauma from war just one or two generations ago, it can be very hard to relax. We have not been modeled that. And especially if you are in a profession that also doesn't model it, it is very hard. And so that was really real for both of them, right? And this model minority pursuit. So always wanting to get to the next rung, do better, get a further education. So a lot of overcompensation in their day-to-day functioning year to year. Now, the cultural trauma, this is it. As I was listening to Daniel, this is really hard to articulate, right? One way I'll highlight this is oftentimes in Asian American cultures, there's a traditional kinship and gender context. And so that means there are roles in the family that have been valued over time. These are not inherently problematic. These have served Asian families abroad for generations, right? Post-migration, when you align these traditional kinship contexts with non-traditional US influences, this bicultural stress is significant for many Asian Americans. This is what I was taught by my parents, but my professors telling me I should speak up more as a woman, but that's disrespectful. How do I interject myself? Should someone give me permission to speak? I mean, so many tensions internally. So Michelle, interestingly, grew up with parents who said, hey, we don't want you to live under this patriarchy we did. So they encouraged her go be a doctor, go do your thing. So she kind of took on a very masculine posture, and she had to survive, right, through medicine and all of that. And then David, actually, it was almost the opposite, where he felt like, I really don't like what patriarchy has done at church, in my home. I saw the way, my parents interacted. So I'm going to fight against it. But what was happening in their relationship is that the implicit ways that patriarchy lives in our bodies was showing up in their dynamic, right? And so Michelle was annoyed and really resentful, and David was confused and felt even more shame about, why am I treating her like this? I don't understand. I don't like it, but sometimes I can't help it, right? And then a survival mentality, right? Their parents passed this on to them. Their parents owned, convenience stores, blue-collar jobs, and that survival mentality was bleeding into their marital life. So common relational stresses in a dyad like this is significant barriers to being emotionally present with one another, right? If you're going, the way you're racialized is always in your body. You can't rest. You're expecting so much of your partner because you're fighting patriarchy, you're fighting racism, and your work is hard. How do you sit and be present with one another and really attend to yourself? Resentment toward their in-laws, all of these complex dynamics, especially related to family trauma, and then constantly critiquing and criticizing not just their partner, but themselves, right? This self-talk. Why can't I get this, right? For both of them. And so it's a case we could continue to highlight, but I wanted to give you a concrete picture of a fairly common presentation of two professionals. When they come together, it is not just as easy as oh, you're a physician, you're burnt out, of course, your work is exhausting, right? But what is the racial lens we can understand this from? What is the cultural lens that is not essentializing, Vietnamese culture or Korean culture, but seeing it as embedded within a world and a context that's racialized? Okay. A couple things for our churches to think about, right? So if Michelle and David are part of your church community, how does this shift how we think about church life? The sermons that are preached, the way that we shape small group. We just went to the amazing presentation by Julie Tai on worship, right? How does it inform our worship practices? So for example, do we have a contextual understanding of our faith? What relationship do we have with God in a sociocultural reality? How we theologically frame our human experience, who God is that connected to these systems of race and culture? What about discipleship and spiritual formation? If people are hurting related to their racial and cultural experiences, how does that change the way that we mentor and disciple? Do we talk about these things? Do we pause and say, hey, I'm really feeling this incident happened with this Asian American in the news. How does this affect how you connect with God, right? Is all of who we are, our Asian American identities, are being beautifully and wonderfully made? Is it welcomed and embraced by God? And I just wanted to briefly mention, this is different in an Asian American ethnic church and in multiracial churches that have Asian Americans. And so just thinking about in the Asian American church, right, our pastors, our lay leaders, really considering explicit integrations of racial identity and cultural identity and not overly either highlighting or minimizing either, right? In multiracial or other church spaces where you have maybe just a few Asian Americans, it's thinking about the ways that I interact with my Asian American parishioners. Am I inflicting additional racial harm? Am I expecting, model minority performance, right? Is there a way that there's a performing for whiteness because it's a predominantly white church? And does that add to my people's racial stress, right? So the last section I'm going to move to is more of the clinical applications and considerations. This is really pared down, but I wanted to highlight, I know this has happened across our weekend together already. Many of us have been doing lots of breathing, lots of attending to our bodies. Trauma always lives in the body. It is not just a cognitive response, a behavioral, but it is physiologically in our bodies and brains. And there's so much that we could say, but literally our brain is changing and causing the responses that we have. And so the way that we then, quote unquote, intervene, that has to be a component. We'll talk about that next. Another piece to consider across ministry, across mental health contexts is what are the ways that the meaning we make of our racial and cultural trauma could be harmful, right? It's one thing to say, this has happened to me and I've debriefed it with friends. It's like, oh, this colleague, forgot that they met me and I know them and their work, but they have no idea who I am, right? What's the meaning I make of that? Do I say to myself, oh, my work must not be significant enough, right? Or do I say, this is the function of racialization, this happens, I'm still cool, right? That meaning we make of that is significant in shaping my well-being. And then lastly, how is trauma played out and responded to in relationships? So we're going to talk about some of these things for all of us in the community, lay leaders, people living life together, for ministry leaders, and then those of us who are practitioners of mental health. I wanted to delineate the difference because, as it's been referenced a few times, we need to know our roles and capacities, right? What can I do as a community member? What can I do as a pastor? What is my role as a clinician? So the first thing, so basic, but so significant, acknowledging and validating. We have many spiritual communities that have yet to do this, right? Which is, wow, we really need to talk about race at our Asian American church. At this point, many churches are really feeling this push, Asian American churches. We have not been doing this, but the pandemic is highlighting that this is critically necessary. Physiological support. How do we attend to our body's needs? And lastly, engage in shifting culture. I'm going to go into more detail with each one of these. So, acknowledging and validating. I hope this is, becoming clear to all of us now, right? We can all deepen our understanding around history and racial context. I'm going to give you an example. I was recently writing a chapter on the racialization of Asian Americans and gender identity. And I was like, what's the history on hyper and asexualization of men and women? And so I did this deep dive and I was like, oh my goodness, right? There were laws in the US in the 1800s that did not allow the Chinamen who came to bring wives. They weren't allowed to marry white women or partner with them. So these Chinamen had their own enclaves of just men, and they were forced to learn how to cook, clean, do traditionally women things, and then they were perceived as asexual. This is just one part of the story, but just to give you a glimpse of even myself, as much reading as I've done around this, there's more that I can learn. So that informs, and that history is inherited for our Asian American brothers, right? Familiarity with common racial and cultural discourses. So Daniel mentioned these, right? The perpetual foreigner, invisibility, right? I want to highlight something, and I know I said I was going to mention this someday when I have a public platform. Those of you who are Asian American, how many have been, someone thought you were another Asian American before? I think everyone's raising their hands, right? For those of us who are not Asian, please study my face, right? When you see my face, I need you to distinguish me from the next Asian American woman. This is so significant. I can't tell you that is such a racial discourse that is so deeply painful. To not be known and acknowledged. It can feel like a minor thing. It's like, oh, they forgot who I am again, right? But over time, it really adds to invisibility. So knowing what are those common racial and cultural discourses so that you can incorporate it into the work that you do. We ourselves really need to work through our own discomfort and our own reactions to trauma, right? We could spend a whole day on this. But if we don't know what our areas of activation are, we can't really lead, serve, and support people through their own processes. We might only be half a step ahead, right? Or we might be going through it together, but we are always working through this. Being present with and center people in their experiences, right? Because of my gender identity as a woman, I will always keep bringing it back to a conversation about gender because this is really significant for the Asian American church, right? Because we have largely male pastors in Asian American churches, the voices and experiences of women in our congregations is often not heard or not clear. So it's important to ask your women, all the minoritized genders in your community, ask, what is your experience? What does it feel like, when I preached about this, right? The way that leadership functions. So when I say center people, this is people other than our own identity, and to really listen. That's what it means to acknowledge and validate. All right, physiological support. This is going to be, sort of separate for each one of these. As a community, all of us can practice and extend self-compassion. Okay, this is really big, and I'm speaking from a we perspective as Asian Americans. And in working with Asian American clients, whenever we have the question of, what are your strengths, right? I don't know. I don't know how to articulate it. I'm really uncomfortable thinking about it, right? Really low levels of self-compassion for lots of complex reasons, right? Not to put that down, but it's an area of growth for us, right? To know what are my strengths, but how can I be kind to myself when I don't hit this mark or someone thinks this of me? It's fine, right? As an Asian American woman, I've had to continue to, but I've learned more and more how to be okay when someone doesn't like me, right? Or I disappoint someone, or I did not put in 100% effort on something and to give myself slack. So self-compassion. Increase interoception. Right? So this is body awareness. Many of us struggle with this because of our anxiety, our depression, our energy is elsewhere that we don't notice, oh my goodness, right now my neck is really tense. Or actually, I have to use the restroom, right? Our body's so disconnected that we don't know what the physiological sensations are. So I know this sounds fairly simple, but as a community, we can all deepen these skills. How do we talk about this together, right? When you're with a friend saying, hey, I know this is a really heavy conversation. I'm feeling it in my chest. How are you feeling right now, right? Pausing and attending to one another. Ministry leaders, what can we do, right? Decenter cognitive knowledge. Dr. Brad Strong just mentioned this at another workshop. But oftentimes in the Asian American church, because we've modeled after the white evangelical church, is valuing head knowledge. What does the Bible say? What do I think? How do I apply my head knowledge, right? How do we have more of an embodied spiritual practice in worship, in community life, right? How do I think about leading someone through Tai Chi, which my church did last year, right? Through breathing practices in the middle of a sermon or a worship session, right? So really decentering that how I think is really the primary avenue through which I might find healing. For those of us who are clinicians, we many of us know this already, supporting clients in connecting with our bodies. And I would say, I'm a certified havening practitioner. Some of us here are, some do EMDR, brain spotting, lots of amazing interventions. I think it's really worth pursuing certification. So many of these models are psychosomatic, and it supports us and our clients in physical body regulation. And if you connect, there's a lot of great networking happening. Ask each other questions like, which model do you like and what should I pursue? And pay a lot of money to get certified in. Yeah, a lot of money. It's always at least $1,000, if not more. Okay. The last thing, engage in shifting culture. What can we as the community do? Detangle from these racialized and cultural discourses. For example, model minority and perfectionism. This happens on a personal level with friends and community. Take time. Maybe not today. I think you're gonna be brain dead by the end of today, but maybe next week, maybe next month during spring break, those of you who have it, think about these racialized discourses. How is that enacted in my life? How do I feel the pressure from that? How can I detangle from it? And how can I support my community in doing that, right? I had to learn as a young faculty person years ago in faculty meetings not to just sit back and listen. I had to learn to interject myself and say, I have something to say, which was countercultural for me, right? And to say, I'm not always going to agree with you. I have a disagreement on this issue, but that was very uncomfortable for me, right? That is me engaging and shifting my immediate culture. Developing comfort with grief and imperfection. This has been another theme of this weekend. How can we be more comfortable with discomfort, right? Our own grief as a community, we need to talk about this, the intergenerational traumas that we've inherited, and the fact that we're not going to be perfect. For the ministry leaders in sermon and church life, challenging the binary, right, and the individualistic discourses. How do we understand all of the tensions, the grays, and to be okay with that, right? Lots of conversation this weekend about triumphalistic theology. It's always hopeful, always good, right? But rather, how do we hold multiple things at once in our understanding of God and ourselves? Model and leading and offering theological frameworks that might not always have answers, right? Embracing the tension. Does that come through in the sermons? And lastly, for mental health clinicians, again, knowing our history and current issues. I don't mean this to put anyone down at all. And many of us know this. Simply referring an Asian American client to an Asian American therapist does not mean that we are getting racially and culturally informed practice, right? All of us need to do the work of understanding our own histories. It's not just my individual experience going to be the same as Daniel's, right? Drastically different. If I, as a Taiwanese American East Asian person, don't look and understand South Asian history, Southeast Asian, I'm not doing my due diligence as a clinician. Partnering with churches to consult. This is where I'm excited. This is where what we do in our DMFT program. Therapists and psychologists, I invite you to think about beyond your clinical work, right? Individual therapy, family, couples. Do you have interest and expertise in serving the local church? Do you have pastor friends you can connect with and say, hey, is there a way we can work on collaboration to support the well-being of our community? Let's put our heads together. So that's my challenge to all of us. There's so much that we can do. And at the end of the day, community members, ministry leaders, mental health practitioners, this is us. We are all selves embedded in family, in churches, in community, in our shared socio-political context within this long history of Asian American history. So I hope that we'll always see, whether it's in our clinical work, in our relationships with people we love, when you're preaching, when you're leading worship at church, that this is how we're imagining who we are and who we can be as a community as we move together with the hope of healing. We're going to end there and transition to our Q&A time.
I can just listen to Jessica all day. It's like, I'm like being healed by your voice.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. All right.
Well, we have some great questions. I will try to list out some resources, obviously, like so for people to look at and read afterwards. So I'll try to list them out afterwards, but let's do some Q&A. First question. Will you be willing to share more about the collaboratory? How will it, what will it be like? And also, how can people get involved?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. Um, it's called the collaboratory because we really, truly want to collaborate. Right now, you saw on the slides, the last few slides, there are no citations. And do we know why? Because there's hardly any research on where this intersects with the Asian American church, right? So as we've been meeting with people, pastors, and therapists, you are the experts of your community. And so through our website, you can sign up to start getting information. And for the local people, just as a side note, we do have a conference coming up in May. This is on Thursday, May 16th. It's for local churches, people in ministry, and mental health practitioners. We're going to come together and think and support one another. But that's kind of the gist. We're starting local, and then we have resources that we're developing that will go on our website. But our vision long term is that through the website, through our podcast, it's a research-based resource center that really is meant to support families, pastors, and therapists.
So for now, go to the Asian American Center website and sign up in our email, and then you'll get all that stuff later on. We're doing a whole reboot of the Asian American Center because what we realized is that we're actually so academically oriented. We've spent like 20 years researching on this thing, but we have to figure out how to get this out there. So we're doing this reboot. Stay connected, and we will share all that goodies with you, right? So, second question. How do you work through the different labels of Asian American, Pacific Islander? Actually, I will share some resources here. This is a book that I use in my Asian American Identity and Ministry class. It's called Asian American Psychology. It's a bit dated because, psychology books, like, you have to, like, every 10 years you need a new one, right? Not like theology books. Oh, last one's 50 years ago. Oh, it's pretty recent, Oh, not psychology. It's like, oh, no, it's old. But this is still good, right? So Asian American Psychology, Current Perspectives by Tawadi and Alvarez. It's an edited volume. It's a great resource. It's a great resource for you to have. You're like, hey, I want to understand adoptee experience because I have an adoptee client. I'm lost. Yeah, read that, right? I want to understand sexuality, like in terms of what that looks like, gender, okay, read that. There's a chapter on that. So Asian American Psychology, Current Perspectives, it's something that we've used in the past. And generally, the idea is the fact that Asian American or API is an umbrella term, right? So it's political, sociological, more of a social understanding. So I tell my kids, you're Asian American, like racially, like politically, but obviously at home, we're Korean American, right? So people have multiple identities. I think that's part of, if you think of it that way. And a lot of Asian Americans are not really trained in this not because they're not doing the due diligence, it's because the whole erasure of Asian American like studies, right? So how do you understand yourself? My kids, even though I teach them so much, they still know more about Black history than Asian American history. Temple City High School, where I live, like majority Asian American kids, school system, like teachers, curriculum still, very little Asian American stuff. So it doesn't really matter. Like, it's very difficult to learn about who you are in a very like academic way, critical way, right? Not you're like what your grandma told you, because half of what your grandma told you is propaganda. It's not right, right? So that's hard to be like, oh my gosh, like, what I learned about Korean War, not true. Like a US propaganda. That's not how Koreans teach it in Korea. Like, oh no, if we center ourselves, we don't think about that war that way. In Vietnam, they call it the Vietnam War, American War. Right? Oh my gosh, you're right. Why would they call that the Vietnam War, right? So anyways, this, I think, is a really good question. So it's a hard one, so I'll give it to you. As a white person, there's all these feelings about this thing, right? So, and it's like there's actually very little space to process things, and there can be a lot of guilt, or it feels like everybody's now beating up on white people in a sense. Like, they can be, is it okay to be racist against white people? How do we sort through all this stuff, and how do we talk about this in a constructive way? I think that's basically my interpretation of the question.
Such a great question. And I'm thinking about my dear students because we've been having some really good conversations about this, I think, in class. I think as followers of Christ, there's a way that I hope we are doing this differently, right? Which is all systems of oppression relationally harm everyone, right? Not just people of color, white people too, because we are disconnected from one another. So on one hand, yes, for example, every time I've taught a class with Asian American students, they typically are last to speak up. They wait to be called upon, they're shy, they feel like it's uncomfortable. So I'll invite them, right? And so in a social setting where there are power dynamics, we have to sort of monitor that and support equitable voices. But when it comes to processing experience, I've experienced from white clients and students that the pain is real of being misunderstood, all of these things. And so hopefully in a spirit of loving one another, we can understand how oppressive systems harm all of us while the nuances of equity are still discussed. So that's just a brief answer to a really good, intense question.
And so much of it, I tell people, like, it's really not about you. Like, the problem's so big, it's like a systemic problem, right? So it's not, we're talking about historical forces, we're talking about systems. I feel like I have sympathized with my white colleagues in terms of patriarchy. Like, I'm like, oh, like, when I have like Asian American women tell me like, okay, you're like just like my father. I'm like, I just met you. I don't know what's happening, right? Like, you're just like them. I'm like, we have no interaction. I don't know. And sometimes I feel like some of my white colleagues feel that way. Like, I literally just met you. You're just like every other white man. I'm like, but you don't even know who I am. So there's multiple things happening here because microaggressions is structural and so many things are happening. In that sense, I can see why people feel that way. Like even against me, like as a man, right? So I don't react. I'm like, that would be stupid to react. It's like digging myself a deeper hole, right? Like, no. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong. Like, I'm like, that's not my place. Because I don't want to add to people's trauma, right? So this is where, how do I serve people? I'm like, it doesn't matter. I understand patriarchy in the Asian American community is real. I get that. So I'm not going to react that way. Even though sometimes it's not fair. But I also know the fact that I'm part of the system. So how do you make sure that you understand yourself in that experience and not necessarily always think of it as a personal thing? It's not a personal attack. I think sometimes, I mean, or it might really be you. So I'm always like, because I make the mistakes on a regular basis. So that's something that you have to kind of own as well, right? So there's complications and I think growth in that way. This is a great question because it's a really complicated topic. And I do not think when we talk about some of these things, it's against white people per se. It's white normativity, it's systems and powers and principalities. That's really what we're really attacking. All right? It's not like, oh, individual people. I think that's a really deep misconception. I think some people who fight that can become racist. And I think that is actually racist. Like saying every single white person is bad. I think that's really, really problematic. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
First of all, thank you both so much. I think this is really important work. And I have a question as someone who's more of like a lay leader. I know that there are cultural and structural reasons as to why Asian American issues have not entered the church dialogue. Like Dr. Lee, you were mentioning how if you go through an American education, as an Asian American, you will end up not learning anything about yourself and you will normalize that erasure. But I'm also wondering, what are some, in your experiences, both of you, what are some theological barriers to this conversation? What are some theological barriers, and how would you then address those and maybe dispel them so that churches who are on the fence and might be feeling the need for this culturally but don't know how to navigate it theologically can learn from that?
So the two resources that I will talk about so I wrote this book because I realized this is a huge problem. And there's a theological problem. So in this book that I wrote called Doing Asian American Theology, which gives you all this vocabulary, there's a whole chapter on race, there's a whole chapter on all this kind of integration as well. I talk about the first couple chapters, theological foundation for that. The fact that God's a covenant of God. God is not a universal God, just timeless. That's not, in other religions, they have a timeless, like abstract principle. That's more of an enlightenment idea. In the Bible, God's a covenantal God that enters time and space. That's not Asian American theology. That's just theology. That's just revelation. This is who God is. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Pascal talks about this. Not God of the philosophers, some enlightened principle for one size fits all. No, a covenant of God that enters time and space, that sees you and meets you. So that's the foundation of all that we're talking about. But because so much of our theology is corrupted by Greek philosophy and Enlightenment ideas, it's just a bad understanding of Bible, straightforward. Not about Black, Asian, Hispanic. No, it's just a bad understanding of what Scripture is. So let's start with that. And if you don't get that correct, then we're not gonna. All this just sounds like propaganda, right? Like, and then gets a problem. There's a question here that I think this is very specific. So as an Asian American woman, all this resonates, but my husband, who's white, who's largely dismissive of my racial experiences, and even some of the awful experiences, it's very frustrating. What advice do you have for me as a spouse, like when it's not being invalidated? And they've been married for a while, so.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge, like, that's a really painful place when your partner can't quite grasp the depth of your lived experience. I don't mean this to be like a simple response. I think finding a really good couples therapist who can navigate those racial conversations is important. I also think that, like, even if you are partnered with another Asian American, there's still potential difference, right? And so even just the openness to, like, sharing things with one another, articles, watching movies about Asian American issues. Like, I think it's one thing to validate your own experience and feel it validated by your spouse. It's another thing to say, hey, if we can't do that, can we look at this third party thing together, right? And be curious about it. So it's just one of many ideas. Happy to chat further with whoever that might be. Oh yeah, let's go to Kristen.
Thank you so much to both of you for your presentations. I've learned so much in the last hour and a half, like nodding my head up and down over and over again. I am thinking a lot about this frame for my question, about this invitation to, like, more faithful allyship, like what it means for those of us who don't belong to the Asian or Asian American communities to walk alongside of you all well, and how do we amplify this visibility that you were talking about so often is missed or erased. I'm thinking specifically about some conversations we've had, Dr. ChenFeng, about these experiences of being confused for other people or being missed. And each time I hear you say something like that as your colleague and friend, I hold something like that as very sacred. And my immediate response is both, how do I join you in that space, though I don't have the exact same lived experience, although I am often mistaken for other Black women as well, so that's its own parallel experience. But also then, what do I do? And I'm mindful this is a dangerous question because often we jump to, what can I do? And jump past the lament, jump past the joining, and I don't mean to do that. But I am curious if there are other practical things that we as individuals can do to be better allies, and then also other things that we can do institutionally, whether that's in faculty meetings or in other spaces, for students in classrooms where they're the ones speaking but their friends are not. If you all have any recommendations of how to join well without taking over.
Sure. Okay. We have a red light, but we're going to keep going and not be a model minority. I'm going to answer your question, Dr. Fort, which I appreciate, by way of example. So the most significant racial healing in my life has happened with non-Asian friends, because that's where so much of the pain has happened, right? And so an example was, and this is that whole thing about, let's know what are the racial discourses that affect Asian Americans. So I was at an MFT national conference, and the presenter, a white man, really essentialized Asian American parenting. He was like, oh, they're all tiger parents, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And I felt this, like, knot in my stomach. I was one of 5 Asian Americans in a group of 300. I'm like, all of these people are getting this terrible perception of Asian Americans, and I was full of dread. And I felt, I didn't even think my white friends were perceiving this. But the moment it was over, 2 of my doctoral classmates said, oh my gosh, Jessica, are you okay, right? The fact that they even knew how to identify that could be painful for me made me realize in our 3-4 years together, we've had enough meaningful conversation for them to understand my experience in a social place. So that's just an example, and I experience this from you, and it's vice versa, right? Like being curious enough about your friend and loved one's racial experience that you can see it unfolding in life, right? Yeah.
That's the last comment, because we really have to end. I would say, in the Asian American Center, we always talk about two different things, like your personal experience. Always distinguish your personal experience and critical knowledge. A lot of Asian Americans have a lot of personal experience, but they don't have critical knowledge, and they don't really realize that. Like, oh, I have more than... So some Asian Americans, they don't want to take my class. They're like, why would I want more Asian American? Like, I have too much. Like, I want less. I'm like, no. Critical knowledge, you don't have any. Like, you sound like a kindergartner. That Chinese bad. I'm like, who talks that way? But people really do talk that way. Like Asian Americans, like, oh, Chinese is bad. I'm like, China? 5,000 years of it, that China is bad? The whole thing is bad? How are you Chinese American talking this way? Are you a kindergartner, right? You have a master's degree. So anyways, it's personal experience, critical knowledge. I think for all the people who are allies, how do you broaden your personal experience? So like my dean, right? Not my dean, but our dean enjoys K-drama. Right? Like, when you go to a Korean restaurant, don't just enjoy like, it's healing for me when my like, because I had a classmate at Seminary who said, he's white, he said his mom went to Korea and talked about how disgusting kimchi was. And I was like, why did you go? This other white guy's like, yeah, I'm gonna try everything. He's like, well, okay, it's interesting. And I was like, that's healing. It's nice. And it's not exotic. He's like, I'm just broadening my life. So how do you broaden your personal life, right? Like, whether it be Filipino food, whatever. If you're in LA, it's pretty easy. Because if you're cultured, you know what's going on. You know what dim sum is. Like, if you're not cultured, you're like, what is this Chinese food? Can I have fried rice? I'm like, oh, you went to dim sum restaurant and you order fried rice? I feel sad for you, but it's okay. So there's that part of it. And then there's critical knowledge. Like, you need to read books. Right, so like I said, Asian American psychology, current perspectives. I think my book was supposed to be a primer to understand this stuff, right? There's a book called like Filipino American Psychology by Kevin Nadal, super helpful. There's a book. Oh yeah.
Can I put a plug?
Yeah, please.
I have a book coming out this year. It's thank you. We are really excited about it. It's the first book in the MFT field on Asian American issues called Asian American Identities, Relationships, and Post-Migration Legacies. Yeah, so it's gonna cover a lot of this, and it's personal reflections from Asian American MFTs telling our own stories for the field.